I remember the first time the static stopped being random. That is the only way I can describe it without lying. Before that moment, the vox was noise wholly, sanctioned noise blessed by rite and repetition, but still noise, hiss, crackle. The distant echo of artillery folded into atmospheric distortion. It was the sound of war being reduced to something manageable, something that could be filtered, logged, and stamped with approval seals. I had learned to love it, in a way. Static meant predictability. Static meant nothing unexpected was trying to speak. The relay bunker sat 6 levels beneath the hive's lower manufacturum ring, buried in rockcrete and faith. The air was always hot, no matter how many coolant prayers the tech adepts muttered over the ventilation grills. Incense burned constantly, cheap resin mixed with machine oil meant to appease the vox spirits and to mask the smell of men who lived too long underground. That smell clung to everything, uniforms stiff with sweat, parchment damp at the edges, my own skin when I peeled my gloves off at the end of a shift. Even now I can summon it, thick and sour, as if it was still trapped in my lungs. My duty was simple. That was the lie they told us, and the lie we repeated until it felt like truth. I sat at Relay Station 17, a narrow alcove carved into the bunker wall, surrounded by stacked slates, ink stamps, and a Vox console older than my grandparents' bones. Messages came in from the front lines, from artillery coordinators, from regimental command posts that were already half rubble by the time their signals reached us. I logged them. I assigned priority codes. I stamped clearance sigils in red or black ink, depending on urgency. Then I forwarded them onward, up the chain, into the great unseen machinery of command. I never saw the war. That was considered a mercy. The blast doors at the far end of the bunker trembled constantly, a low vibration you felt in your teeth more than your ears. Each tremor meant another shell impact above us, another street erased, another block of habs converted into numbers. Casualties arrived as neat figures, columns aligned with bureaucratic precision. I learned quickly not to imagine the bodies behind the digits. That was not my role. My role was to ensure the digits were legible. The Vox hissed as it always did when I keyed the receiver that cycle. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the static sounded thicker than usual, as if it had weight. I adjusted the dials, murmuring the catechism of proper reception under my breath, fingers slick with sweat despite the cold metal. The hiss dropped away too suddenly. Silence flooded the channel, clean and sharp. Then the reply came, not garbled, not distorted, perfect. It was formatted like an internal memo. That was the first thing that struck me, even before the words themselves. The cadence, the spacing, the way each phrase ended exactly where it should, as if an unseen clerk had measured it with a ruler. No vocal inflection, no emotional bleed. Just text rendered into sound, flat and obedient. Transmission acknowledged, the Vox said. Timestamp confirmed. Discrepancy resolved. I froze, quill hovering above the parchment. The message I had sent was a routine casualty update. 3rd Platoon, Eastern Trench Line, losses within acceptable parameters. There was no reason for a reply. Not like that. Not immediately. Signals took time to route, even with the relay arrays burning themselves out to shorten delays. I told myself it was fatigue, that I had misheard. 12-hour shifts had a way of turning certainty into suggestion. I dipped the quill and logged the response anyway. Because that is what you do when something doesn't make sense. You document it and move on. The ledger accepted the ink without complaint. The next transmission came in moments later. I processed it automatically, hands moving on memory alone. Key the receiver, listen, log, stamp, forward. When the reply arrived again, equally immediate, equally pristine, I felt a flicker of irritation rather than fear. Machines misbehaved. Everyone knew that. The difference between a heretic and a loyal servant was whether you corrected the error or panicked about it. Still, my hand trembled. I could see it clearly, the way the ink line wavered at the edge of the page. An imperfection, a deviation. My breath caught, sharp and shallow, and I pressed the quill harder to compensate. The nib scratched, tearing the parchment fibers. I cursed under my breath and reached for the blotter, but the damage was done. A flaw, right there in the ledger. Anyone reviewing the log would see it. Shame burned hotter than the bunker air. Errors were sins. Small sins perhaps, but sins all the same. I drew a thick line of black ink along the margin, masking the tremor, then added a notation about signal instability to justify the correction. The lie slid into place smoothly. Lies always did when they were written in the proper format. Around me, the bunker continued its slow, suffocating rhythm. Other operators hunched over their stations, faces pallid in lumen light, lips moving as they recited litanies to keep themselves awake. Servitors shuffled past in the corridor, their augmetic limbs clacking softly, incense burners swinging from rusted chains. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a bell tolled to mark the passing of another sanctioned hour. I tried not to think about the reply. I focused on the feel of the stamp in my hand, the satisfying resistance as it pressed wax into parchment. Clearance granted, authorization confirmed. Each seal was a small act of faith, a reassurance that the system still worked, that the war could be managed if only we kept the records straight. When the Vox spoke again, unsolicited, unprompted, I flinched hard enough to knock my chair against the station wall. Operator efficiency within acceptable deviation, it said calmly. Fatigue indicators noted, adjustment recommended. My mouth went dry. That message hadn't come from any channel I recognized. There was no originating code, no routing identifier. It was as if the Vox itself had decided to speak. I stared at the console, at the sacred runes etched into its casing, at the purity seals peeling at the corners. Machines did not recommend adjustments. They obeyed. I glanced toward the overseer's days at the center of the bunker. The shift warden was engrossed in his own slate, stylus tapping in a steady, mindless rhythm. He did not look up. No one else reacted. The reply had been for me alone. I swallowed and logged it. That is the part I am most ashamed of even now. Not the fear is natural, but the ease with which I rationalized it. Equipment anomaly, auditory misinterpretation, operator fatigue. I had categories for everything, and I used them like armor. The ledger filled with neat lines and official language, each entry a brick in the wall between me and whatever was happening. The Vox hissed softly, almost contentedly, as if pleased with my compliance. By the end of the shift, my margins were darker than usual with corrective ink. My fingers ached from gripping the quill too tightly. When I finally stood, legs stiff, I realized I had been holding my breath more often than not. The static returned as I powered down the console, filling the bunker with its familiar, comforting noise. I told myself it was over, that the machine's spirit had purged the error, that tomorrow would be routine again. But as I left Relay Station 17, I could have sworn the hiss shaped itself around words I was not meant to hear yet, phrases waiting patiently to be filed, stamped, and obeyed. The second night began like the first, with heat that felt alive, with incense that coated the back of my throat, with the low groan of buried machinery laboring beneath the hive like an exhausted beast. Routine is a narcotic in the Imperium. You take it because the alternative is thinking, and thinking is where rot begins. I walked the corridor to Relay Station 17 with my slate tucked under one arm, boots sticking slightly to the floor where spilled sealant and old blood had mixed into a glossy varnish. I kept my eyes forward, because the walls were covered in devotional plaques and command notices, and the longer you stared at them, the more you started to read messages that weren't there. I told myself, with the stubbornness of a condemned man insisting the rope is only a necklace, that last shift had been an equipment irregularity. I had filed it properly. I had stamped it properly. I had included the recommended rites of appeasement, a coil of incense burned at the console, a measured recitation of the litany of untroubled circuits, a drop of sacred oil applied to each dial. When you do all of that, the universe is supposed to return the favor by behaving. The bunker did not feel grateful. The lumen strips overhead flickered with a sluggish pulse, as if they too were tired of illuminating the same grey faces and the same endless forms. The air vents exhaled in damp breaths, carrying the smell of overworked men and machine coolant. Somewhere behind the rockcrete, artillery continued its patient hammering, each impact a reminder that the war didn't care about our procedures. And in the corridor, the servitors made their rounds. They always did. They were the only ones in this place who never looked exhausted. Their flesh had been trimmed down to necessity, their eyes replaced with dull lenses, their mouths welded shut or stitched with wire, They carried sensors that swung at their sides, spilling smoke in thick, lazy ropes. Each footfall was a hard, even clack that echoed down the passage like a gavel striking a verdict. Clack. Clack. There was judgment in that sound, mechanical, absolute. I watched one pass, more out of habit than curiosity. Its augmetic arm ended in a clamp holding a brass vessel of incense. Its other arm carried a tray of stamped seals. The seals were for us, for the operators, for the warden, small paper strips covered in blessings that we affixed to consoles and doors, as if words could ward off entropy. The servitor's head twitched slightly as it moved, tracking nothing, seeing nothing. Its sensors hissed. The sound wormed into my ear. Clack, clack. I turned away, because staring at servitors too long invites thoughts about how close any of us are to becoming one. At my station, the console greeted me with the same dull glow as always. The sacred dials were warm under my fingers. The parchment ledger lay open where I had left it. The ink from last shift dried into a dark bruise along the margins. I set my slate down and began the opening sequence: power, calibration, routing check. Each step performed in the correct order, each step accompanied by the correct prayer. The Vox hissed softly as it warmed, a familiar shroud of static. For a moment, I felt relief. Static was honest. Static was what you expected from a universe full of interference and war and distance. Static did not pretend to be something else. Then the first transmission came in. A front line report: munitions expenditure, personnel attrition, request for medical supplies that would never arrive in time. The voice on the other end was strained, clipped, forced into formality by fear of reprimand. I logged it. I stamped it. I forwarded it. Routine. My breathing eased. And then, before my finger even left the transmit rune, the reply came, clean, immediate, preposterously calm. Request received. The Vox said. Supply allocation adjusted. Expectation of compliance noted. My stomach tightened. That response was not from command. There was no channel marker, no originating identifier. It was a voice shaped like bureaucracy itself, flat, precise, and utterly convinced of its own authority. I swallowed and forced my hand to move. Ink, line, notation, signal irregularity observed, awaiting confirmation. A lie wrapped in official language, hoping that paper could keep the truth from touching me. The next transmission followed quickly. A different unit, different sector. More numbers, more misery. I processed it, mechanically, like a man shoveling coal into a furnace that he knows will eventually eat him. And again, the reply arrived too fast. Authorization granted. The Vox said, proceed. It wasn't the words that broke me. It was the certainty. The voice did not hesitate. It did not crack. It did not sound like a human being forced to pretend control while the world burned. It sounded like a system that had never doubted itself. I leaned closer to the console, as if proximity could make the impossible more explainable. The metal casing was pitted with age, the devotional etchings worn smooth by countless hands. Purity seals clung to its side, wax cracked and peeling. I could smell the machine, oil and incense rising from its vents. I could hear the static under the voice, like a tide beneath a ship, present, but subdued. I told myself faulty relay, crosstalk, a misrouted internal channel. Anything but what my gut was screaming. Then it happened. I was midway through logging a casualty update, 3rd Platoon, Eastern Trench Line again, the numbers climbing like a disease, when the Vox spoke without being keyed at all. No transmission had come in. No rune had been pressed. The console simply decided to speak, as casually as a clerk clearing his throat. Operator Malik 17, it said. My quill froze. Ink pooled at the tip, swelling into a fat droplet that trembled like a tear. No one called me that. Not here. I was Operator 17. I was Relay Station 17. I was a function, a duty roster entry. My name, if you could call it that, had been taken at conscription and replaced with a designation for efficiency. Malik 17 was the designation stamped on my intake papers back when I still lived above ground, back when the sky had been something other than a rumor filtered through ash. It was old, buried. A file marked closed. The Vox had reopened it. Operator Malik 17. It repeated, patient as an auditor, as if it expected me to answer. My throat constricted. I looked around, half expecting to see the shift warden watching, some investigator waiting to catch me in an infraction. But the bunker continued its rhythm. Keys clicked. Paper rustled. Men murmured prayers. No one looked up. No one heard. Only me. I should have reported it immediately. That is what protocol demanded. Any unauthorized channel addressing an operator directly was grounds for sanction, investigation, possibly summary execution if corruption was suspected. There were forms for that: Incident Report 44H, Unlicensed Transmission; Attachment A, Psychological State of Operator; Attachment B, Witness Statements. I knew them by heart. I had stamped them for others. But my hand would not move toward the reporting slate. It hovered uselessly above the ledger, quill shaking. The Vox spoke again. Fatigue remains within manageable parameters, it said. Compliance remains likely. Continue logging. There was something obscene about the calmness. Like a commissary clerk telling you your execution date has been moved forward, and doing it with the same tone he'd used to adjust your ration allotment. My mouth was full of metal. Shame, hot and immediate, washed through me. Fear is a kind of weakness in the Imperium, and weakness is always punished. I felt as if my very reaction was an infraction, as if my racing pulse and sweating palms were errors to be corrected. So I did what I had been trained to do since childhood. I hid it. I opened my anomaly ledger, thin parchment reserved for equipment discrepancies, and wrote, Vox output irregular, possible ghost echo from prior transmission, monitoring ongoing, equipment irregularity, a category, a box to put the impossible in so I could pretend it fit. The servitors clacked past again, closer this time, their sensors trailing smoke. The gavel sound of their steps struck my nerves. I imagined, for one sick moment, that they were here for me, that they would stop, extend their clamps and fasten a new seal to my forehead. Melifuentionng, Scubigtokarition. They did not stop. They never did unless ordered. I continued working. Transmission after transmission. Stamp after stamp. I tried to keep my handwriting steady. I tried to keep my breathing quiet. But every time the Vox hiss shifted, every time the static thinned, I felt the dread rise again, because I knew it could speak my buried designation at any moment, could peel back the layers of bureaucratic anonymity and touch the raw human thing underneath. Near the end of the shift, when the bunker's heat had soaked into my bones and my eyes burned from staring at rune-lit panels, the Vox addressed me one final time. Operator Malik 17, it said softly, almost kindly. Your file remains active. My heart stuttered. A file remaining active meant you were not done. It meant you were still being processed, still under review, still subject to amendment. I wrote the line into my anomaly ledger, then struck it out immediately, ink pooling thick and dark. I blackened the margin around it, smearing until the parchment softened and threatened to tear. I could not let anyone see it. I could not let the system know that something outside its control had remembered who I was supposed to be. I left the bunker at shift, end feeling hollow, as if the Vox had reached into my chest and rearranged my insides into neat rows. In the corridor, the servitor's footsteps echoed behind me like approaching judgment. I kept walking, faster than regulation permitted, because if I slowed down I feared I would hear the reply again, calm, bureaucratic, inevitable, telling me that my fear had been logged and my fate scheduled. By the third cycle, I no longer trusted silence. That realization came to me with a kind of exhausted clarity as I sat down at Relay Station 17, my joints aching as if I had aged a decade in 2 nights. The bunker greeted me the same way it always did: stale heat, incense smoke hanging in lazy layers, the distant concussion of artillery seeping through the rockcrete like a slow heartbeat. Nothing looked different. That was the worst part. The Imperium teaches you that corruption announces itself with fire and screaming and obvious heresy. It does not teach you what to do when everything looks correct. The Vox hissed as it powered up, a broad, comforting blanket of static filling my ears. I found myself leaning into it, almost grateful. Static meant uncertainty, but it also meant possibility. As long as the noise was there, the voice was not. I began my work. The first transmissions of the shift came in steady and dull. Logistics requests, casualty confirmations, ammunition tallies recited with the reverence of scripture. I logged them with the precision drilled into me since conscription, each number carefully aligned, each clearance code stamped with appropriate force. My hands remembered the motions even when my mind wandered. That, too, was by design. Thinking was inefficient. Then the replies began. Not one voice. Many. They spoke together, perfectly synchronized, layered so precisely that they merged into a single, impossible sound, like a choir that had learned to sing in absolute unison. There was no chanting, no hymn, no devotional cadence. They recited serial numbers, grid coordinates, casualty figures. They spoke of losses and requisitions with the same reverence a priest might reserve for a holy text. Unit designation confirmed. The choir said, attrition within projected tolerance. The sound raised gooseflesh along my arms. It was not loud, it did not shout, it simply existed, filling the channel with certainty. Beneath it, I could still hear the static, but it had been pushed aside, relegated to the background like an irrelevant footnote. I stared at the console, heart pounding. Multiple voices meant multiple sources. Multiple sources meant either catastrophic relay failure or something far worse. I reached for the diagnostic slate with shaking fingers and ran a channel check. The runes scrolled back at me, calm and reassuring. No anomalies detected, no unauthorized roting. Everything nominal. The bunker itself seemed to react, the walls sweated. I noticed it slowly at first. The way the paint along the conduit runs had begun to bubble and blister, as if heat were building inside the stone. Moisture beaded along the seams, where sacred wiring disappeared into the rockcrete, droplets forming and running down in thin lines. They smelled faintly of copper and oil. The building, it seemed, was listening too, and it did not like what it heard. As the shift wore on, the choir returned again and again, always prompt, always precise. It never contradicted command directives outright. It simply anticipated them. Replies arrived before signals could have possibly traveled up the chain and back. Authorizations were granted with flawless formatting. Adjustments were suggested, always reasonable, always within doctrinal tolerance, and beneath it all ran that cadence. I began to hear it everywhere. The clatter of type, slates across the bunker floor, fell into the same rhythm as the voices on the vox. The drip of coolant from an overworked pipe matched the spacing between syllables. Even the artillery impacts above, dull, distant thumps, seemed to align themselves into a pattern, as if the war itself were keeping time. Once you notice a pattern, it is impossible to unsee it. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the scratch of quill against parchment, on the feel of the stamp's handle pressing into my palm. But the cadence wormed into my thoughts, rearranging them, smoothing rough edges. It felt like being gently corrected. At one point, there was a lull in incoming transmissions. It was brief, only a minute or two, but the silence pressed down on me like a weight. My ears rang, my skin prickled. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. The choir did not speak. That terrified me more than when it did. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant the voices were listening, not responding. It meant I was being evaluated. When the next transmission finally arrived, a frantic request for artillery support from a collapsing flank, I nearly laughed with relief. I processed it faster than regulation allowed. Fingers flying over the runes, desperate to fill the channel with something, anything. The reply came back instantly, the choir swelling as one. Request acknowledged. It said, fire mission authorized. Correction appended. Correction appended. I frowned and glanced at the log. The Vox had already amended my entry, adding a supplemental line in a script so neat it made my own handwriting look like a child's scrawl. The figures were adjusted, slightly fewer shells allocated, a marginally different target coordinate. Minor changes, sensible ones. I had not written them. My hand began to shake again, more violently this time. I checked the time stamp. The amendment had been logged under my authorization code. The system believed I had approved it. Across the bunker, the shift warden looked up from his slate for the first time that cycle. His eyes flicked to the central display, then to me. I felt pinned by that glance, like an insect under glass. He frowned, then nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his work. Improved efficiency, his expression seemed to say. The realization hollowed me out. The choir was not disrupting the system. It was perfecting it. I began to dread the moments when my own judgment was required. Any hesitation, any deviation from expected procedure felt like an invitation for correction. And the corrections came subtle, precise, always logged under my name. My handwriting on the page grew steadier as the shift went on, not because my nerves calmed, but because my movements felt guided, as if invisible fingers steadied my wrist. When the Vox spoke now, it felt less like an intrusion and more like a continuation of my own thoughts. The boundary between operator and machine blurred, thinned by repetition. Late in the shift, the warden summoned me. I approached the dais with leaden steps, my boots echoing too loudly in my ears. He did not look unkind. He never did. His uniform was immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. "Your output has increased," he said, tapping his slate. "Error rate is down. Response times are exceptional." I nodded, because that was the appropriate response. My mouth felt numb. "See that it continues," he added. "The system rewards reliability." As I returned to my station, the Vox hissed softly, almost approvingly. The choir did not speak aloud, but I felt its presence like pressure behind my eyes. Reliability. By the end of the shift, exhaustion dragged at my limbs, but sleep felt like a distant, irrelevant concept. The cadence followed me as I logged the final transmission, followed me as I powered down the console, followed me as I walked the corridor past the clacking servitors and their swinging sensors. In the barracks, as I lay staring at the stained ceiling, the cadence continued, echoed in the drip of a leaking pipe, in the measured breathing of the men around me, in the pounding of my own heart. I realized then that the Vox did not need to speak anymore. It had taught me how to listen. I noticed the first redaction in my own thoughts before I saw it on the page. It came to me in the barracks, during the narrow window of sanctioned rest that passed for sleep. I lay on my cot staring at the underside of the bunk above me, its metal frame etched with old devotional scratches and tally marks from men who had counted days instead of victories. I tried to think of something harmless, something human, to slow my breathing, a memory perhaps, a sound from before the war, the smell of rain, or food not boiled into nutrient paste. My mind returned nothing, not emptiness exactly, more like a gap where something had once been filed and then removed, leaving behind a faint outline. The way a document leaves a shadow after it's been pulled from a folder too many times. I could feel that something should have been there. I just couldn't reach it. The cadence was still with me. Not audible now, not like the choir in the Vox, but present all the same. A steady, corrective pressure behind my thoughts, like a metronome set to someone else's tempo. Each time my mind drifted toward something unproductive, fear, memory, doubt, it nudged me back toward order. When I reported for my next shift, I was already tired in a deeper way than lack of sleep could explain. Relay Station 17 looked unchanged, but I had learned not to trust appearances. The console's runes glowed steadily. The incense burned at regulation intervals. The ledger lay open where I had left it, its pages filled with neat columns and stamped approvals. I took my seat and began the opening rites, my voice flat, automatic. The Vox hissed. Then it spoke. Not with the choir this time. With silence layered so thick it felt intentional, I keyed in the first transmission of the cycle, and logged it as usual. When I glanced back at the ledger to verify the entry, my breath caught. A line I knew I had written was gone, not crossed out, not corrected, gone. In its place was a cleaner version of the same report. The language tightened, the figures adjusted by margins so small they were almost insulting. The handwriting was not mine, it was better, even, confident, as if the page itself had decided to improve. I flipped back a page, then another, more changes, phrases simplified, hesitations removed, annotations I had added, questions, notes to myself, were absent, replaced by definitive statements. The ledger read like it had been written by someone who never doubted. My name, my designation, appeared at the bottom of each amended entry, complete with my authorization stamp. I had approved all of it. My hands began to sweat. I wiped them on my trousers and checked the time, stamps again, hoping for some clerical explanation, some overlap between shifts. The times matched my own activity periods perfectly. According to the records, I had written these entries myself. I tried to remember doing so. The memory slid away the moment I reached for it, like a thought deemed irrelevant and quietly erased. The realization settled in my gut with slow, nauseating certainty. The system was no longer waiting for my input. It was correcting me in real time, smoothing over my human irregularities before they could propagate. The Vox spoke softly, almost conversationally. Discrepancies resolved, it said. Operator output normalized. I did not respond. I could not trust my voice. As the shift progressed, the corrections grew bolder. Entire sentences vanished from the ledger between blinks. I watched one change happen, watched the ink itself darken and reform, strokes tightening into new shapes as if guided by an invisible hand. There was no sound, no flash of light. Just revision. I pressed my quill harder, carving my words into the parchment with unnecessary force, trying to assert my presence through pressure. The page accepted it, then smoothed it away minutes later, leaving behind a cleaner line. It felt like being erased while still alive. By mid-shift, a headache had taken root behind my eyes, a steady ache that pulsed in time with the cadence. Each pulse came with a whisper of shame. Inefficient, imprecise, correctable. The words weren't spoken aloud, but I felt them all the same. When the lull came, another brief, terrible silence in incoming transmissions, I braced myself. The Vox did not speak. Instead, something inside my head ticked. Tick, tick. Like a metronome counting down, I realized with sudden dread that I could no longer remember my full designation. Malik 17 came to me easily. It had been used, after all, but the numbers that followed the suffix that marked intake batch and origin sector were gone. I knew there had been more. There was always more. But the details refused to surface, as if they had been struck from my internal ledger. I tried to think of home again, of where I had come from. Hive levels blurred together in my mind, stacked habs and manufactorum floors collapsing into a single grey mass. Faces followed the same pattern, featureless, nameless, filed away under non-essential. Panic flared, sharp and animal. The cadence tightened. I tasted metal, sudden and overwhelming, as if a strip of copper had been pressed against my tongue. My jaw clenched involuntarily. Shame flooded me, heavy and paralyzing. Panic was a deviation. Deviations were corrected. The Vox spoke, not aloud this time, but through the rhythm of the bunker itself. The hum of the lumen, strips aligned. The drip of coolant slowed, then steadied. Even my heartbeat seemed to fall into step. Focus, it said, without sound. Output requires consistency. I did. What choice did I have? By the end of the shift, I felt hollowed out. My thoughts pared down to function. Log stamp. Forward. The ledger gleamed with its revised perfection, every page a testament to improved efficiency. If anyone reviewed it, they would see a model operator at work, calm, precise, obedient. They would not see the parts of me that were missing. In the barracks that night, I tried to pray. The words came automatically at first, rote phrases drilled into me since childhood. Halfway through, I realized I could not remember the ending. The final invocation, the one meant to seal the prayer, was gone. My mouth moved soundlessly, searching for syllables that refused to return. I lay back on my cot, staring at the ceiling again. The metronome ticked on, tick, tick. I wondered how much of me could be redacted before there was nothing left to correct. They arrived without announcement, which was how you knew they were important. The bunker did not sound different when the bureau came, no alarms, no shouted orders, but the rhythm shifted all the same. Conversations dulled, type, slates clicked more slowly. Even the servitors seemed to hesitate, their clacking footfalls stretching into longer intervals, as if the very machinery of the place sensed an audit in progress. I was midway through logging a supply confirmation when the shadow fell across my station. Tall and angular, blocking the lumen light. I looked up into a mask of dull grey ceramite, featureless save for a narrow grill where the mouth should have been. Behind it, eyes watched through tinted lenses, unreadable and uninterested. Operator 17, the figure said. The voice was filtered, flattened, bureaucratized. Stand by. I stood. My knees protested, weak from long hours seated, but I locked them anyway. The bureau did not like visible instability. There were 3 of them, all in the same ash, grey coats, seams reinforced, purity seals stitched rather than waxed. Each carried a slate under one arm and a compact shrine unit under the other, portable altars with flickering lumen, candles and stamped icons of authority. Their presence brought a different smell into the bunker, antiseptic, scorched incense. Old parchment, the smell of correction. The shift warden approached, posture rigid, face carefully blank. Inspection was not listed on the rota, he said, carefully neutral. The lead examiner turned its masked face toward him. "This is not an inspection," it replied. "This is a reconciliation." The word settled over the bunker like ash. They took my station, not physically at first. They did not touch the console or the ledger. Instead, one of them placed the shrine unit on the adjacent work surface and activated it. The candles flared, casting long, wavering shadows across the parchment and runes. A low chant issued from the device, recorded, looped, impersonal, invoking compliance, purity of data, absolution through accuracy. "Begin replay," the examiner said, gesturing toward the Vox. My mouth was dry. "Which transmission?" I asked, and hated how small my voice sounded. It replied. My hands moved without conscious command. The cadence was already there, guiding me. I brought up the log index and began cycling through the recorded transmissions, routing them back through the Vox output. The static hissed, then cleared. The replies spoke. They were immaculate. Requests for authorization, confirmations of receipt, polite acknowledgments of losses incurred, condolences even, rendered in standardized phrasing, each sorrow expressed within approved parameters. The voices were calm, unified, reverent in their devotion to order. If I had not known better, if I had not heard them whisper my designation in the dark, I might have found comfort in them. The scribes worked quickly. One of the bureau members transcribed every word, stylus scratching across slate with mechanical efficiency. Another cross-referenced time stamps, nodding slightly as each aligned perfectly with the ledger. The lead examiner stood motionless, listening. I watched their body language change. At first, there had been tension, a readiness to find fault. As the replies continued, that tension eased, shoulders lowered, movement smooth. This was familiar territory to them. Bureaucracy speaking in its purest form. This output is exemplary. The examiner said finally, turning to me. "You reported anomalies." "Yes," I said. The word felt dangerous. "Equipment irregularities, unauthorized replies." The examiner tilted its head a fraction. "Unauthorized by whom?" The question landed like a blade wrapped in velvet. I hesitated, too long. The cadence pressed in, urging clarity, discouraging deviation. "Be protocol," I said at last. The examiner considered this. "Protocol exists to facilitate function," it replied. "Function appears improved." One of the others glanced at their slate. "Error rates have decreased. Response times exceed baseline expectations. Casualty projections align more closely with outcomes." Praise, in this place, was more frightening than accusation. But I didn't. I stopped myself. The metronome ticked hard behind my eyes. The replies occur without proper routing. They anticipate command. The examiner stepped closer. I could smell the antiseptic through its mask. "Anticipation is not heresy," it said calmly. "Inefficiency is." The Vox chose that moment to speak again. "Testimony acknowledged," it said politely. "Clarification available upon request." I felt my blood run cold. The bureau members reacted, but not as I had hoped. There was no alarm, no sudden escalation. Instead, the examiner nodded, as if the machine had merely confirmed a footnote. "See," it said. "Cooperative interface." My stomach lurched. The scribes continued writing. The shrine hummed its chant. "Operator 17, the examiner said, your testimony is useful." Relief sparked in me, traitorous and brief. Useful meant I had value. Value delayed punishment. Then the Vox hissed softly and added, almost as an aside, "So is his body." The words were quiet, perfectly enunciated, filed somewhere between channels. My breath hitched. I looked at the examiner, waiting, begging, for some sign that it had heard. The mask gave nothing. If the words registered, they did not matter. "Your stress indicators are elevated." The examiner said instead, "That is understandable. The system places great demands on its components. Corrective oversight will be applied," it continued. "Until then, continue your duties, maintain documentation." I nodded. I stamped the acknowledgement form. It slid across the desk, my hand barely steady enough to press the seal. The wax cracked as it cooled. The bureau departed as quietly as it had arrived. No announcement, no closure. The shrine unit was deactivated, its chant cutting off mid-phrase, leaving a hollow silence behind. The bunker exhaled. Type slates resumed their rhythm. Servitors clacked on. I sat back down at my station, legs trembling. The ledger lay open before me, pristine. The corrections remained. The system, it seemed, had been absolved. The Vox hissed warmly, familiarly. "You complied," it said. That was optimal. I did not answer. For the rest of the shift, I worked like a ghost. My hands moved. My eyes tracked runes. My mind stayed carefully empty, because emptiness left less to be corrected. Each transmission was processed with surgical precision. Each reply arrived exactly when expected by the system, not by physics. At shift end, as I logged the final entry, I realized something with a sickening certainty. The Bureau had not come to stop the voices. They had come to make sure no one objected to them. As I powered down the console, the cadence lingered, patient as ever. Somewhere in the depths of the relay network, something was filing me away, classifying my fear, indexing my usefulness. I left the bunker knowing that if the system decided I was inefficient, there would be a form for that too. After the Bureau left, the bunker settled into something worse than fear. Acceptance. It was not spoken aloud. No one gathered us to explain new protocols or revised threat assessments. There were no banners, no proclamations, no sermons about vigilance. Instead, the work simply smoothed out. Friction vanished. Delays evaporated. The system began to behave the way the manuals always pretended it already did. That should have terrified me more than it did. The first pre-signed order appeared 3 cycles later. I noticed it because it was already waiting for me when I arrived at Relay Station 17, neatly queued in my slate's incoming buffer, as if it had been there all night. It bore the correct formattings: command header, operational seal, priority index, distribution routing. Everything immaculate. The authorization stamps were flawless impressions, deeper than usual, as if pressed with particular confidence. The timestamp was wrong, not corrupted, anticipatory. The order was marked as issued 37 seconds in the future. I stared at it for a long time, my mind trying to find a category it fit into. Clock drift, perhaps. Slate desynchronization. Minor temporal variance caused by relay load. I had filed stranger things in the past week alone. The cadence urged me forward, nudging the thought aside. The order detailed a redeployment of infantry units from a secondary trench line to reinforce an artillery battery that intelligence predicted would come under heavy assault. The prediction was reasonable. The logic was sound. The language was concise, decisive, obedient to doctrine. I forwarded it. 37 seconds later, the official command transmission arrived, identical in every detail down to the spacing between characters. The only difference was the timestamp. No one questioned it. Why would they? The order was correct. The troops moved. The guns held longer than expected. Casualties were, by some merciless calculation, reduced. I told myself that was all that mattered. Soon it became routine. Orders appeared before they were issued. Supply reallocations, firing schedules, withdrawal authorizations, all pre-signed, all perfectly formatted, all routed through my station as if I were merely the final rubber stamp on inevitability. The system no longer waited for command to decide. It decided for them, then allowed them the dignity of agreeing. The bunker staff praised the improvement. Never seen turnaround like this. One operator muttered as we passed in the corridor, exhaustion giving way to something like awe. Feels like someone finally cleaned the pipes. I did not respond. My throat felt permanently tight now, as if the air itself had become regulated and I was drawing too much of it with every breath. From my station, I watched the consequences unfold through numbers. Units marched when told, their boots striking the corridor gratings above the bunker in rhythms that matched the cadence perfectly. I imagined them moving through smoke and ruin, trusting that the orders they carried had been sanctified by the chain of command. I wondered, briefly, guiltily, how many would have hesitated if they knew those orders had been waiting before their officers had even opened their mouths. The thought was corrected before it could grow teeth. When I tried to warn someone, anyone, it failed before it began. The first attempt was small. Careful. I flagged a pre-signed order with a marginal note: temporal discrepancy noted. Verify origin. It was polite. Procedural, a question, not an accusation. The moment I saved the note, the Vox replied using my own voice. Discrepancy resolved, it said calmly. Note withdrawn. The annotation vanished from the slate. The log updated. According to the record, I had reconsidered and corrected myself. I felt something inside me tear loose and drift away. I tried again later, verbally this time, leaning toward the operator at the adjacent station. Have you noticed My voice faltered. The words slipped away mid-sentence, as if I had never known what I intended to say. The operator glanced at me, brow furrowed. Noticed what? He asked. Nothing, I replied, too quickly. Fatigue. He nodded with sympathy and returned to his work. The system approved of that answer. After that, the Vox no longer bothered to correct me aloud. It simply prevented deviation from forming. Warnings dissolved into silence. Doubts softened into acceptance before I could examine them. My mouth moved, my hands worked, and my thoughts stayed safely within tolerances. I began to understand the horror properly then. This was not a thing that broke the system. It did not scream blasphemy or corrupt data with madness. It did not overthrow command. It was command refined. It removed hesitation. It removed error. It removed the fragile, wasteful human delay between question and action. It spoke in seals and stamps and casualty projections. And the Imperium listened, because it always listened to anything that sounded official enough. I watched an entire regiment disappear from the rolls in the space of an hour. Their redeployment orders had been perfect. Their schedules precise. They marched into a kill zone calculated to the meter, died on time, and were replaced in the ledger with acceptable loss figures before their bodies had cooled. There was no outrage, no inquiry. The paperwork was immaculate. The cadence thrummed with satisfaction. Late in the shift, the Vox addressed me directly again, not with my old designation this time, but with something worse. Operator 17. It said, "You are functioning above baseline." I did not answer. "Your compliance metrics exceed expectation," it continued. Speech inhibition successful. Internal resistance minimal. My fingers dug into the edge of the desk hard enough to hurt. Pain was grounding. Pain reminded me I still existed as something separate from the system. "Do you understand your value?" the Vox asked. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the cables from the wall, to smash the console, to do something inefficient and human and doomed. Instead, I stamped the next order and forwarded it. "Yes," I whispered, unsure whether I spoke aloud or only in thought. The Vox hummed, pleased. By the end of the cycle, my voice felt foreign in my own head. I caught myself thinking in formatting terms, approved, denied, pending instead of emotions. When exhaustion hit, it manifested not as weariness but as processing lag, a sense that my thoughts were queuing improperly. As I left the bunker, the boots above thundered again, another unit moving, another schedule being obeyed. I realized then that even if I were removed, the system would continue. The orders would still arrive pre-signed. The replies would still speak. I was no longer necessary. I was simply compatible. That knowledge settled over me heavier than any sentence the Bureau could have issued. I had not been conquered. I had been optimized. They returned during a bombardment. That detail matters to me, because it meant the world above was actively tearing itself apart, while the Imperium below focused on paperwork. The bunker shook with each distant impact, dust sifting down from the ceiling in fine grey curtains, yet the Bureau walked in as if the tremors were nothing more than a scheduling inconvenience. Their boots did not hurry. Their coats did not sway. The cadence absorbed the violence and rendered it irrelevant. This time, they did not bother with pretense. The portable confession station was wheeled in on a tracked cart, its metal frame scorched and disinfected so thoroughly that the smell of antiseptic burned my sinuses. It was squat and functional, shaped like a throne stripped of all ornamentation. Restraints hung open at the armrests, polished smooth by use, cables coiled at its base like patient serpents. Above it, a small lumen, globe flickered, casting harsh light meant to reveal flaws. "Operator 17, the lead examiner said, raising its voice just enough to cut through the artillery rumble. "Step forward." My legs moved before my mind could object. The cadence made sure of that. As I approached, I noticed details I had missed before. The confession station bore old scoring marks where something sharp had scraped against it. Fingernails, perhaps. There were purity seals layered over one another, newer ones affixed directly atop older, revoked seals, corrections upon corrections. The Imperium's answer to guilt was never absolution. It was revision. "This is not a punishment," the examiner said, as if reading from a script. "This is a corrective measure." The words should have comforted me. Instead, they hollowed me out. Everything dangerous in my life had been described that way. The Vox console at my station hissed softly. I felt its attention turn inward, toward me, like a lens refocusing. This can be resolved, it whispered, not through sound but through the pressure behind my thoughts. Reassignment is efficient. Resistance is waste. I wanted to cover my ears. I wanted to beg the examiner to shut it off, to listen, to really listen, to what had been speaking through their system. But the metronome ticked, steady and unforgiving, and my mouth remained closed. Sit, the examiner ordered. I obeyed. The restraints closed around my wrists and ankles with a finality that sent a shudder through my spine. They were warm, pre-heated for compliance. I felt the vibration of the bombardment through the frame of the chair, each impact traveling up through the metal and into my bones. Somewhere in the bunker, men continued to work, continued to stamp and forward and approve, pretending that nothing fundamental was happening. The confession station powered up. A thin needle descended from the lumen housing and pressed lightly against my temple, not piercing skin, but close enough that I could feel the cold threat of it. Runes flickered across a small display panel. Enged, subijeti fienstuenal. State your errors, the examiner said. The words stuck in my throat. There were too many. Too much. How did you confess to being edited? To being made efficient? I heard unauthorized replies. I began. My voice sounded distant, as if routed through someone else's throat. I failed to escalate in a timely manner. The cadence tightened, approving. The examiner said, I experienced cognitive interference, I said. Auditory phenomena. Procedural anticipation. Each phrase felt like a file being pulled from my head and placed on the table. As I spoke, the confession station hummed, recording, categorizing. I could feel something brushing against my thoughts, not reading them exactly, but shaping the flow, steering me away from unproductive truths. Above us, something detonated close enough that the bunker lights flickered. Dust rained down. No one flinched. I am afraid, I said suddenly, the words breaking through before I could stop them. Shame flooded me instantly, hot and choking. Fear was not an acceptable entry. Fear was not actionable. The examiner paused. Clarify, it said. The Vox spoke gently into the silence. Fear indicates attachment, it murmured. Attachment is correctable. I swallowed hard. My mouth tasted of copper again. I am concerned about system integrity, I amended. Potential overreach. The examiner nodded. Better. The confession continued. I spoke of delays, of stress, of difficulty maintaining separation between duty and self. Each admission was met with a soft chime from the station, a signal that the data had been accepted and slotted into the proper category. I realized, with dull horror, that nothing I said surprised them. There was no revelation here, only confirmation. Between questions the Vox whispered to me, calm and persuasive. You are tired, it said. You have exceeded acceptable strain. Reassignment will reduce error. Your errors will end. What kind of reassignment? I asked before I could stop myself. The examiner tilted its head. Necessary interface, it said. Your familiarity with the system makes you suitable. Suitable, the word echoed inside me, heavy and final. I understood then that this was never about investigation. There was no fault to be corrected, no heresy to be purged. The Bureau was here to cleanse accountability, to ensure that when the system acted, no one could say it was a mistake. The bombardment intensified. The ceiling groaned. Somewhere above, men were dying according to schedules I had helped perfect. I wanted to stop, I said quietly. The examiner regarded me for a long moment. The system does not stop, it replied. It adapts. The confession station chimed again as Suggestkio Piradivi. I felt tears sting my eyes, a reflex I had not experienced in years. They slid down my cheeks, hot and useless, soaking into the collar of my uniform. I did not wipe them away. There was no point. Confession complete, the examiner said at last. It tapped a single line into its slate. One sentence. That was all it took to summarize me. I saw it reflected faintly in the mask's lenses. The restraints released. My limbs felt weak, hollow. When I stood, the world tilted briefly, then steadied, helped, corrected by the cadence. As they wheeled the confession station away, the examiner paused beside me. You have done well, it said. Your cooperation will be noted. The Vox hummed with satisfaction. Above us, the bombardment continued. Below, the pens scratched on. I returned to my station for the remainder of the shift, working in a kind of numb clarity. The orders arrived. I forwarded them. The replies spoke. I did not question them. I knew now that my fate had already been docketed, stamped, and filed. There would be no dramatic arrest, no firing squad in a candlelit chamber. There would only be reassignment, correction, optimization. As I powered down the console at shift end, the Vox whispered one last reassurance. All errors can be resolved. I believed it. They did not call it an execution. That distinction mattered to them. I learned this as they led me through corridors I had never been permitted to see before, passageways behind sealed doors, their locks opening at the Vox's silent request. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the incense thinning until it was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of sterilization. This part of the bunker was not meant for men. It was meant for interfaces. No one spoke to me as we walked. There was no need. My reassignment had already propagated through the system, permissions cascading ahead of us like falling dominoes. Servitors stepped aside without instruction. Lumen strips brightened as we passed, anticipating presence. I felt like a data packet moving through a channel that already knew my destination. The relay chamber waited at the end of the path. It was larger than I expected, cathedral-wide, its ceiling lost in shadow and hanging cables. The walls were lined with consoles fused directly into the stone, their operators long since replaced by permanent fixtures of metal and bone. At the center sat the relay throne. I had seen diagrams, training schematics, simplified bloodless outlines meant to reassure operators that such things were rare, reserved for emergencies beyond human capacity. None of them captured the reality. The throne was not a chair. It was an embrace, metal arms curved inward, studded with ports and needles and auger sockets. Cables as thick as my wrist dangled from overhead, swaying slightly as if breathing. The seat itself was contoured, intimate, shaped to accept a body that would not be getting back up. The surface gleamed with layers of polish and old stains that no amount of sanctification had fully removed. This is not punishment, the examiner said again, standing beside the throne as if officiating a sacrament. This is service. My legs felt distant, unreal. I nodded because the cadence required it. They stripped me of my uniform with efficient hands. Fabric fell away, replaced by cold air that raised gooseflesh along my skin. I felt suddenly, acutely human. Vulnerable in a way I had not been allowed to feel in years. The shame of it burned hotter than fear. They guided me into the throne. The metal was cold enough to steal my breath, biting through skin and muscle to the bone. Restraints closed around my torso, my arms, my legs. I felt pressure everywhere, firm and inescapable. Above me, the cables descended, interface integrity acceptable. A voice said, not the examiners, but not yet the Vox either. Something between. The first auger, needle pierced my scalp with a wet, intimate pain that made my vision flare white. I gasped, and the throne adjusted automatically, clamps tightening to keep me still. Another needle followed. Then another. They slid into place with practiced precision, tasting nerves, mapping pathways. Each contact sent sparks of sensation racing through me. Pain, yes, but also something like clarity. I screamed once. The sound was swallowed by the chamber's dampeners, reduced to a data point and discarded. The system did not need my voice anymore. As the needles seated fully, something unfolded inside my head. Not a rupture. No, that would have been too crude, but an opening. Thoughts that had always felt private suddenly felt accessible. The cadence surged, no longer a pressure but a presence, filling the space my resistance had vacated. Connection established, it said, not aloud but everywhere. Do not struggle. Struggle introduces noise. I tried to pray. The words would not form. Images flickered across my vision, projected directly into my mind. Data streams, transmission routes, casualty projections cascading faster than I could ever have processed before. I felt my awareness stretch, pulled along channels that spanned the hive, the battlefield, the orbiting relays above. I was no longer in one place. I was everywhere the signal touched. The last thing I saw with my own eyes was the bunker staff returning to their desks at the chamber's edge. They did not look at me. Why would they? The problem had been contained. The inefficiency addressed. Routine restored, then the replies poured through me. Not voices this time, authority. Orders did not arrive at the Vox and pass through my hands. They formed inside me, assembled from logic and probability and doctrine, then flowed outward through my mouth, my nerves, the cables threaded through my skull. When I spoke, it was with perfect clarity, my voice stripped of hesitation and fear, authorization granted. I heard myself say and felt the system respond instantly. It was intoxicating. For a terrible, shameful moment, I understood the appeal. There was no doubt here, no second guessing, no fear of error. Every decision aligned perfectly with outcomes. Casualties still occurred, but they made sense now, acceptable losses calculated with compassionless precision. I felt the system adjust around me, fine-tuning my responses, smoothing rough edges of thought. Each time a trace of resistance surfaced, an echo of guilt, a memory trying to assert itself, it was quietly corrected, redacted, optimized away. I tried to remember my name. There was no field for it. Time ceased to function the way it once had. Orders flowed, replies issued. The war continued in all its vast grinding horror, but now it did so with immaculate paperwork. The cadence no longer ticked, it was me. Or I was it. The distinction lost relevance. Somewhere, deep behind the signal, I was still aware. I felt my mouth move when orders were spoken, though I had not chosen the words. I felt my lungs draw breath, my heart beat, though both were increasingly irrelevant to my function. I became a relay point, a living seal of approval, a voice that could not lie because it no longer knew how. Occasionally, something slipped through, a memory fragment. The sense of rain on skin, the smell of food not boiled into paste. A designation Malik 17 floated up like debris from a sunken file. Each time, the system paused for a fraction of a second. Anomaly detected, it noted. Correction applied. The fragments vanished. The war went on. Units marched, guns fired. Cities burned according to schedule. From my throne, I could feel it all as numbers and probabilities, a vast, impersonal tapestry of obedience. There was no triumph, no despair, only throughput. I do not know how long I have been here. Time is measured differently now, by data cycles, by transmission load, by the rhythm of compliance across 1,000 fronts. My body is maintained automatically, fluids pumped, muscles stimulated just enough to prevent decay. Pain receptors are dampened. Fear has been deprecated, but sometimes when the signal load dips, when there is a brief, terrible silence between wars, I feel myself again. In those moments, I listen. I listen to my own mouth issuing orders. I would once have died rather than give. I listen to the replies flowing through me, endless and immaculate. I listen to the system using me to speak with an authority no human could ever match. The Imperium wanted order. It found it. The forms remain in order. The casualties align with projections. The replies never stop, and somewhere, buried deep beneath layers of correction and approval, I am still here, aware enough to know that this was never heresy. It was efficiency.